I never used to be paranoid. Sure, I locked my doors at night and set the alarm, but that was just common sense. Then I installed a doorbell camera. It was supposed to be a simple upgrade, a way to feel more secure. But what started as a small precaution quickly turned into a waking nightmare. It began on a quiet Tuesday night. I was sitting on my couch, half watching some crime drama on TV, when my phone buzzed. A notification from the doorbell camera app, movement detected at the front door. I glanced at the clock, 10:45 p.m. Too late for a delivery and too early for the paperboy. My pulse quickened as I opened the app. The video feed was grainy in the dim porch light, but I could make out the shape of a person standing just beyond the threshold. They weren't moving, just standing there, facing the door. The sight was unsettling, but what really made my skin crawl was their mask. It was an old, cracked porcelain mask, like something out of a Victorian funeral. "Can I help you?" I said aloud, half expecting the app to somehow relay my voice to the stranger. They didn't respond, didn't even flinch. After a few minutes, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I watched until the feed was empty and then replayed the video twice, trying to shake the feeling of dread settling in my gut. The next morning, I found a single white rose on the doormat. There was no note, no explanation. I told myself it was probably just a prank, maybe some kids messing around. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for me. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was a one-time thing. 2 nights later, it happened again. The same notification, the same masked figure standing motionless on my porch. This time, they held up a piece of cardboard with a single word scrawled in black marker: "Watching." I shouted at the screen, demanding they leave, but again, they turned and walked away without a word. Sleep eluded me that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. The rational part of my brain told me it was just a prank, some weirdo trying to scare me. But another part, a darker part, whispered that this was something more. The next morning, another rose. I called the police, but there wasn't much they could do. They took a report and promised to keep an eye on the area, but without a clear threat, their hands were tied. I installed extra locks, bought a baseball bat, and kept my phone by my side at all times. A week passed without incident, and I started to relax. Maybe it was over, maybe they had moved on to someone else. Then, one Friday night, the notification came again. This time, the masked figure was closer, almost pressed against the door. I could see their eyes through the slits in the mask, dark, empty holes that seemed to bore into my soul. They didn't move, didn't hold up a sign, just stood there, staring. I called out, my voice shaking, telling them to go away. They cocked their head to the side, as if contemplating my words, then slowly raised a hand to the mask. For a horrifying moment, I thought they were going to take it off. But instead, they pressed a finger to where their lips would be and made a shushing gesture. The next morning, another rose. I was at my wit's end. I hardly slept, jumped at every sound, and felt eyes on me even when I knew I was alone. The police could offer little comfort, and I started to feel like I was losing my mind. One night, I decided to confront the figure directly. I sat by the door, bat in hand, watching the feed. Sure enough, just past midnight, the notification came. The figure was there as always, standing just beyond the door. Heart pounding, I threw open the door and stepped out, bat raised. "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" I shouted into the night. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. I took a step forward, bat ready to swing, but the figure didn't flinch. Then, without a word, they turned and walked away into the darkness. I stood there, shaking with adrenaline and fear, unsure of what to do. The next morning, there was no rose. I thought maybe it was finally over, that my confrontation had scared them off. But that night, I didn't get a notification. Instead, I woke up to a sound from inside the house. I grabbed the bat and crept downstairs, heart in my throat. The house was dark, silent, but I could feel a presence. I checked the lock, still secure. Then I saw it. On the kitchen table, where I had left my phone, was a single white rose. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the phone, hands shaking, and checked the app. The last recorded video showed the figure stepping onto the porch, but instead of standing there, they moved out of frame. A second later, the feed cut out. They had found a way inside. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of the intruder. Just the rose, a silent message that they had been inside my home while I slept. I don't sleep much anymore. The doorbell camera is still there, but I rarely check it. It's a reminder of the eyes that watch from the shadows, the figure that could return at any time. I've thought about moving, but the fear has rooted itself too deeply. Every night, I lock the doors, set the alarm, and keep the bat by my bed. And every morning I wake up, dreading the sight of a white rose waiting for me. I moved into the old house on Cedar Street because it was a steal. Freshly divorced and looking to start over, I needed a place that was cheap and quiet, and this place seemed perfect. It was quaint, almost charming, with a big front porch and a yard that stretched into the woods. The neighbors were distant enough to offer privacy, but close enough to make me feel safe. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days unpacking and my nights scrolling through social media or watching movies. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with a notification from the doorbell camera app. Movement detected at the front door. I opened the app, expecting to see a deer or maybe a stray cat. Instead, there was nothing, just the empty porch illuminated by the dim light. I shrugged it off as a glitch, but it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always around the same time, just after midnight. Each time the camera picked up movement, but there was nothing there. I started to feel uneasy, but I told myself it was probably just a technical issue. Then one night the notification came earlier, 11:45 p.m. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when my phone buzzed. I hesitated, staring at the screen before opening the app. The porch was empty as usual, but this time there was a shadow in the corner of the frame. It moved slowly, shifting just enough to catch my eye before disappearing. My heart pounded as I replayed the video. The shadow was there, unmistakably. It lingered at the edge of the camera's view, just out of reach of the porch light. I couldn't make out a clear shape, but it was large, human-like. The next morning, I checked the footage again in the daylight. The shadow was gone, and there was nothing unusual on the porch. I tried to brush it off, but the memory of that shadow gnawed at me all day. When night fell, I made sure to lock all the doors and windows, double-checking each one before heading to bed. The notification came again at midnight. This time, I was ready. I opened the app immediately, and there it was, the shadow, larger and closer than before. It moved in a slow, deliberate way, creeping towards the front door. My skin prickled with fear as I watched it disappear once again. I didn't sleep that night. The fear had taken root deep in my mind, and every creak of the house made me jump. I decided to call a technician the next day to check the camera, convinced it was malfunctioning. The technician arrived in the afternoon, a burly man named Joe. He checked the camera and the app, running diagnostics and testing the equipment. "Everything looks fine," he said, scratching his head. "No glitches, no bugs, the camera's working perfectly." His words didn't comfort me. If the camera wasn't malfunctioning, then the shadow was real. I thanked him and spent the rest of the day on edge, waiting for nightfall with a growing sense of dread. That night, the notification came right on schedule. Midnight. My hands trembled as I opened the app. The shadow was there again, closer than ever. It lingered for a moment, then started to move towards the door. I watched, paralyzed with fear, as it reached out a hand, an indistinct, dark shape, and pressed against the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, a sharp ring that sent my heart racing. I stared at the screen, unable to move, as the shadow stood there, hand on the bell. It stayed like that for what felt like an eternity before finally retreating into the darkness. The police arrived quickly after I called them, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no evidence of any intruder. Just my shaky voice recounting the story of a shadow that only I could see. The next few nights were torture. The notifications kept coming, and each time the shadow was closer, more defined. I started to see the outline of a face, twisted and grotesque, lurking just beyond the camera's reach. Sleep was impossible, and my days were consumed with a paranoid fear that seeped into every corner of my life. Desperation drove me to research the history of the house. I scoured old newspapers, talked to neighbors, and even visited the local library. The house had a dark past. Decades ago, a man named Henry had lived there. He was a recluse, shunned by the community, rumored to be involved in dark, occult practices. One night, he vanished without a trace. Some said he had summoned something he couldn't control. Others whispered that he had been taken by whatever he had worshipped. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront the shadow. I placed a circle of salt around the porch and hung a protective charm above the door. That night, I sat by the window, watching the feed on my phone. Midnight came, and the notification buzzed. The shadow was there, more solid and menacing than ever. It moved towards the door, but this time, it stopped at the edge of the salt circle. I watched in horrified fascination as it seemed to struggle, pressing against an invisible barrier. The shadow's face twisted in rage, a silent scream that sent chills down my spine. It couldn't cross the circle. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. The shadow retreated, and the notification stopped. I kept the salt circle and the charm in place, and the house felt lighter, safer. The fear that had gripped me slowly began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. The shadow was gone, banished by the protective measures. But sometimes, late at night when the wind howls and the house creaks, I think I can still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for its chance to return. And I know, deep down, that it will never truly be gone. I never believed in ghosts, or monsters, or any of those creepy things people tell stories about. But after what happened last month, I can't shake the feeling that something unexplainable is out there, watching. It all started when I bought a doorbell camera. My neighborhood isn't the safest, and I wanted some extra security. I installed it myself, feeling a little proud of my handiwork. The first few days were uneventful. The camera picked up a few stray cats, the occasional delivery, and once my neighbor's kid trying to sneak out after curfew. Nothing unusual. Then one night, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. Movement detected at the front door. I groaned, thinking it was probably another cat, but when I checked the live feed, there was a figure standing in the shadows just beyond the porch light. The image was grainy, but I could make out the outline of a tall man. He wore a long coat and a hat that cast his face in darkness. He didn't move, didn't try to approach the door, just stood there as if waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. I watched for a few minutes, hoping he'd leave, but he remained motionless. I decided to use the app's intercom feature. "Can I help you?" I said, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, his face hidden. I repeated myself, louder this time, but still no reaction. Finally, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I couldn't sleep after that. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? What did he want? Why didn't he respond? The next day I checked the footage again, hoping to find some clue, but it was the same eerie scene. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the porch light, then walking away. The following nights were quiet. I began to think it was just a one-time thing, maybe a lost drunk or a prank. But a week later, the notifications started coming more frequently. Each time, it was the same man, standing in the shadows, never moving, never speaking. One night, I decided to stay up and watch the feed in real time. Midnight came and went, and I started to feel foolish. Maybe it was all in my head. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the figure appeared. This time, he was closer, just at the edge of the porch. I could see more details now. His coat was tattered, his hat worn and frayed, but his face was still hidden in darkness. I called out through the intercom again, demanding to know who he was, what he wanted. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed directly at the camera. A wave of fear washed over me. It felt like he was looking right at me, through the camera, through the screen, into my very soul. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. When I looked again, he was gone. The next morning, I found something on the porch. A small, old-fashioned key, rusty and worn. There was no note, no explanation. Just the key. I called the police, but they were as baffled as I was. They took a report, but couldn't do much else. They suggested I keep the key as evidence and call if anything else happened. Days passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I I started to avoid the porch, using the back door instead. Every night, I would check the camera, dreading the moment I might see that figure again. Then, one night, the power went out. I was plunged into darkness, my heart racing. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the breaker, but everything seemed fine. The neighborhood was dark too. It wasn't just my house. I sat in the living room, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the power to come back. A soft chime broke the silence. The doorbell. My blood turned to ice. The camera shouldn't work without power. I checked my phone, but it was dead, the battery drained. The doorbell chimed again, more insistent this time. Summoning all my courage, I crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. The figure stood on the porch, paid closer than ever. His face was still in shadow, but I could see his eyes now, dark and hollow. The doorbell rang a third time. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight tighter. I didn't want to open the door, but something compelled me to do so. Slowly, I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he held out his hand, the same hand that had pointed at the camera. In it, he held the rusty key. I stared at it, confusion and fear battling in my mind. Then, without a word, he dropped the key on the porch and stepped back into the shadows. The power came back on an hour later. I sat on the couch, the rusty key in my hand, trying to make sense of what had happened. Exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to find the key had changed. It was no longer rusty and worn, but looked new, almost pristine. And attached to it was a small note in neat, old-fashioned handwriting, "For when you're ready." I don't know what the key opens or what it means, and I haven't seen the figure since that night. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever door this key unlocks, it leads to something dark, something waiting just beyond the shadows. And one day, I fear, I will have no choice but to find out.